You didn't come across this by accident. There are moments when life doesn't send you entertainment. It sends you a message disguised as curiosity. And if you feel something strange while reading this title, don't ignore it, because what you're about to hear might explain why your life feels different lately, even if nothing around you has changed. Every human begins life by absorbing other people's definitions, and this is not something we consciously choose or negotiate. It happens quietly, almost invisibly, in the background of upbringing, culture, family structure, and environment. Before we ever develop the ability to question, we are already learning what is considered right, acceptable, admirable, or shameful. These early imprints do not arrive as formal lessons. They arrive as tone, reaction, approval, disapproval, silence, reward, and punishment. A child does not ask whether a belief is true or false. A child simply learns what brings connection and what creates distance. Over time, this emotional mapping becomes the foundation of identity, and from this foundation, an entire worldview begins to form. As years pass, these borrowed definitions become so familiar that they stop feeling borrowed at all. They begin to feel like personal truth. A person starts to believe that their preferences are entirely self-generated, when in reality many of them are inherited conclusions shaped long before conscious reflection was possible. Ideas about success, stability, attractiveness, intelligence, discipline, relationships, and worthiness are absorbed and stored in the mind as unquestioned assumptions. This is how identity is built in its earliest form, not through discovery, but through repetition. The mind learns what to value, not because it has evaluated alternatives, but because it has been repeatedly exposed to certain standards until they feel natural. What makes this process even more powerful is that it is reinforced by belonging. Human beings are deeply social, and the desire to belong often outweighs the desire to understand. So even when something inside feels slightly misaligned, the pressure to conform smooths over that discomfort. A child learns quickly that acceptance is safer than authenticity, especially when authenticity threatens approval. This dynamic does not disappear in adulthood. It simply becomes more sophisticated. People continue to adjust themselves to fit invisible expectations, often without realizing that they are still operating within frameworks designed by others. The result is a life that appears self-directed on the surface, but is actually guided by internalized external voices. Eventually, a subtle tension begins to form between lived experience and inherited belief. A person may achieve what they were told would bring fulfillment, yet feel an unexpected emptiness. They may follow a path that was praised, yet feel internally disconnected from it. This is where the borrowed nature of beliefs starts to reveal itself, not through intellectual debate, but through emotional dissonance. The life that was supposed to feel meaningful begins to feel slightly misaligned, as if it was constructed according to a blueprint that no longer matches the current shape of consciousness. This misalignment is often misinterpreted as failure or confusion, when in reality it is the first signal that awareness is beginning to separate from conditioning. At this stage, the mind often attempts to restore comfort by reinforcing familiar narratives. It tries to fix discomfort by adjusting external circumstances, changing environments, or increasing effort within the same framework. But the deeper issue is not external structure, it is internal authorship. The question that slowly begins to surface is not whether life is working, but whether the life being lived was ever fully chosen in the first place. This question does not arise loudly. It appears quietly in moments of reflection, in pauses between routines, in unexpected dissatisfaction that cannot be traced to a single cause. It grows not as a breakdown of identity, but as a soft interruption of automatic belief. Over time, what once felt like solid truth begins to feel more like inherited programming. The distinction between what was chosen and what was absorbed becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. This realization does not immediately dissolve identity, but it loosens its certainty. The mind begins to observe itself more critically, noticing how many of its reactions are rehearsed, how many of its desires are conditioned, and how many of its fears are inherited rather than personally verified. In this space, the foundation of the first constructed self begins to reveal its borrowed architecture. The first awakening is rarely understood while it is happening because it does not arrive with clarity or celebration, but with necessity. It is not a spiritual event in the way people often imagine it, and it is not a moment of enlightenment where everything suddenly becomes meaningful. Instead, it is a transition forced by responsibility, pressure, and the demands of functioning in a structured world. It begins when a person is no longer allowed to remain purely dependent on external direction and must start making decisions that carry consequence. In this stage, life is not about truth or deep understanding, it is about adaptation. The individual learns how to navigate systems, expectations, and outcomes in a way that allows survival and participation in society. During this phase, awareness is still largely practical. A person begins to understand how to earn stability, how to avoid obvious failure, how to meet external standards, and how to build a socially acceptable identity. The focus is not on questioning the meaning of the system, but on learning how to operate within it efficiently. This is why the first awakening feels productive. It creates functionality. It turns dependence into independence, confusion into structure, and uncertainty into routine. However, this functionality comes at a cost that is not immediately visible. The cost is depth. In order to survive effectively, the mind simplifies experience into categories that can be managed quickly. Complexity is reduced to performance, and internal reflection is often postponed in favor of external execution. As this stage continues, identity becomes closely tied to role fulfillment. A person is no longer simply existing. They are performing roles that have been socially defined and reinforced. These roles may include professional identity, family expectations, and social positioning. Each role comes with rules that are rarely questioned because questioning them feels inefficient or risky. Over time, the individual becomes skilled at maintaining these roles, sometimes to the point where the performance feels identical to the self. The boundary between who the person is and what the person does becomes blurred. Life begins to operate on repetition, where success is measured by consistency rather than authenticity. Within this structure, emotional awareness is often secondary to functional awareness. Feelings that do not contribute to productivity or stability are minimized or postponed. The mind learns to prioritize outcomes over introspection, and this creates a subtle disconnect between lived experience and internal truth. Even moments of dissatisfaction are often interpreted as problems to be solved rather than signals to be understood. The individual becomes efficient at managing life, but less attentive to the deeper quality of that life. Everything continues to move forward, yet something essential remains unexamined beneath the surface of movement. What makes the first awakening incomplete is not that it is false, but that it is partial. It introduces responsibility without yet introducing deep self-inquiry. It teaches how to function, but not necessarily how to understand why one functions in a certain way. It builds competence in dealing with external reality, but does not yet fully open the door to examining internal construction. Because of this, many people remain in this stage for long periods, believing that increased efficiency is equivalent to fulfillment. They refine their routines, improve their performance, and stabilize their external lives, while the internal questions remain dormant or unrecognized. However, over time, the structure that was built for survival begins to show limitations. The strategies that once created stability start to feel repetitive. The roles that once provided identity begin to feel restrictive. The efficiency that once felt empowering starts to feel mechanical. This is not a failure of the system itself, but a signal that consciousness has expanded beyond the system's original design. The mind that once needed clear structure for survival now begins to sense the absence of deeper alignment within that structure. At this point, life continues externally in much the same way, but internally, something begins to shift in perception. Actions are still performed, responsibilities are still met, and goals are still pursued, yet there is an emerging awareness that functioning is not the same as understanding. The first awakening, which once provided direction and clarity, now becomes the very framework that is being quietly questioned from within. The discomfort that begins to surface at this stage is often misunderstood because it does not arrive as a clear problem with a clear cause. It is not the kind of discomfort that can be easily explained by external circumstances such as career dissatisfaction, relationship conflict, or environmental stress. Instead, it appears as a subtle internal mismatch between who a person has become and the framework through which they have been living. On the surface, life may still appear stable, even successful, yet something within no longer fully participates in the experience. There is movement without full presence, achievement without full satisfaction, and continuity without full emotional alignment. This internal tension is particularly confusing because it does not necessarily interrupt daily functioning. A person can still perform their responsibilities, maintain social roles, and achieve external goals while simultaneously feeling a quiet sense of detachment from the very structure they are operating within. It is not that life stops working, it is that it stops feeling fully coherent from the inside. The mind continues to follow established patterns, but awareness begins to observe those patterns rather than fully merge with them. This creates a dual experience of living and watching oneself live, which can feel unfamiliar and disorienting. What intensifies this experience is the gradual realization that many internal motivations are not as self-originated as previously believed. Desires that once felt personal begin to reveal layers of conditioning. Choices that once felt intentional begin to show traces of repetition and influence. Even emotional reactions start to appear less spontaneous and more patterned. This does not mean that everything is artificial, but rather that the level of unconscious influence is far greater than previously acknowledged. The discomfort arises not from loss of control, but from the recognition that control was never as absolute as assumed. As this awareness deepens, there is often an attempt to resolve the discomfort by adjusting external life conditions. A person may seek new environments, new goals, or new relationships in the hope that change in surroundings will restore internal clarity. While these changes can provide temporary relief, they often fail to address the underlying source of tension. This is because the discomfort is not primarily rooted in external circumstances, but in perception itself. The way life is being interpreted has begun to shift, even if life itself has not dramatically changed. The inner framework that once provided coherence is no longer fully aligned with current awareness. This stage is often marked by a quiet but persistent questioning of previously accepted assumptions. Ideas about success, identity, purpose, and fulfillment begin to feel less absolute and more constructed. There is an increasing sensitivity to contradictions that were previously ignored. Situations that once felt normal may now feel slightly misaligned, not because they are objectively wrong, but because the observer has changed. This shift in perception creates a gap between external continuity and internal interpretation, and it is within this gap that discomfort takes shape. The emotional tone of this stage is often subtle rather than dramatic. It is not necessarily characterized by intense suffering, but by a persistent sense of not fully belonging to one's own life. Familiar routines may continue, but they no longer carry the same emotional certainty. Interactions may continue, but they may feel slightly less immersive. Even moments of success may feel muted, as if they are occurring within a framework that no longer fully fits the evolving awareness of the individual. This discomfort is not a signal of breakdown, but a sign of transition in perception. It reflects the growing distance between inherited frameworks and emerging awareness. The mind that once relied on fixed structures for stability begins to recognize the limitations of those structures in defining lived experience. As a result, internal coherence starts to shift away from automatic interpretation and toward deeper observation, even if that observation initially feels uncertain or destabilizing. The most profound shift in this stage is not what changes in the external world, but what stops happening internally without conscious notice. Life, which once required deliberate attention in every step, gradually becomes automated. Decisions that once felt intentional begin to occur with minimal reflection. Responses that once required emotional engagement begin to appear instantly, almost mechanically. This is how a human being becomes efficient, not only in action but in identity. Over time, this efficiency replaces presence. What remains is a life that continues to function, but with decreasing awareness of the deeper experience behind the function. This automation does not happen suddenly. It develops slowly through repetition, habit, and adaptation to social and personal demands. The mind learns patterns that reduce effort and increase predictability. These patterns are not inherently negative. In fact, they are necessary for navigating complexity. However, when they become the dominant mode of living, they begin to shape not only behavior but perception itself. A person no longer experiences each moment freshly. Instead, they interpret new situations through previously established templates. This creates the illusion of continuity while gradually reducing genuine engagement with the present. As automation deepens, self-observation begins to emerge. It is subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. A person may find themselves watching their own actions as if slightly detached from them. They notice themselves speaking before fully considering the meaning of their words. They observe themselves agreeing, deciding, or reacting in ways that feel familiar but not entirely conscious. This is not dissociation in a clinical sense, but a shift in awareness, where identity begins to include an observing dimension that was previously inactive. The individual is no longer only the participant in their life. They are also becoming the witness of it. This witnessing creates a new layer of experience that can feel both enlightening and unsettling. On one hand, it brings clarity. It reveals patterns that were previously invisible. It exposes how much of daily behavior is guided by repetition rather than deliberate choice. On the other hand, it disrupts the comfort of automatic living. What once felt natural begins to feel constructed. What once felt like spontaneous identity begins to feel like learned performance. This does not immediately change behavior, but it changes the relationship to behavior. In this stage, many previously unquestioned aspects of life begin to appear more deliberate than they actually are. The way time is structured, the way priorities are chosen, the way conversations unfold, and the way emotional responses are expressed all begin to show traces of conditioning. The individual starts to recognize that much of what they call personality is actually pattern. This realization does not diminish identity, but it destabilizes the assumption that identity is fixed or fully self-authored. It introduces the possibility that much of what has been lived was organized by repetition rather than conscious design. The resistance to this awareness is also part of the process. The mind naturally prefers stability, and automation provides stability through predictability. Therefore, when awareness begins to interrupt automation, there is often internal friction. A person may try to return to previous levels of unconscious flow simply because it feels easier. But once observation has begun, complete return to unconsciousness becomes difficult. The awareness that behavior is being observed changes the nature of behavior itself, even when no external change occurs. This is where the concept of automatic living becomes most visible. Life continues to unfold through established routines, but awareness no longer fully merges with those routines. There is a growing sense that experience is happening through layers rather than directly. The individual begins to sense the distance between action and awareness, between reaction and reflection, between participation and observation. This distance is not a separation from life, but a reconfiguration of how life is experienced internally. As this continues, the structure of automatic living is no longer fully invisible. It becomes something that can be seen while still being lived. And once something is seen in this way, it no longer operates in exactly the same unconscious manner as before. What is often described as losing oneself at this stage is actually the gradual dissolution of a version of identity that was never fully conscious to begin with. The feeling of confusion, emptiness, or internal disorientation does not arise because something essential has been taken away, but because something constructed is no longer holding the same authority over experience. For a long time, identity was experienced as stable and continuous, built through repetition, validation, and adaptation to external expectations. But when awareness begins to grow beyond those structures, the foundation that once felt solid starts to reveal its temporary nature. This experience can be deeply unsettling because the mind tends to interpret stability as safety. When familiar patterns of thought, desire, and behavior begin to lose their emotional certainty, it can feel as though something fundamental is breaking down. However, what is actually happening is not destruction, but reorganization. The self that was formed through accumulated conditioning is no longer fully compatible with the expanding awareness that is now observing it. This creates a gap between who a person has been functioning as and who they are beginning to perceive themselves as becoming, and it is within this gap that the sensation of losing identity emerges. During this phase, previously clear definitions of self begin to lose rigidity. Statements like what someone wants, what someone believes, or what someone is become less fixed and more fluid. This does not mean that preferences disappear, but rather that their certainty is questioned. Desires that once felt deeply personal begin to show traces of influence from environment, upbringing, and repetition. Beliefs that once felt absolute begin to feel like interpretations rather than truths. Even personality traits begin to feel less like permanent features and more like expressions shaped by context. This shift does not erase identity. It loosens its boundaries. The emotional experience of this process is often described as emptiness, but emptiness here is not absence in the literal sense. It is the absence of fixed reference points. When identity was strongly defined, it provided a continuous sense of orientation. When those definitions begin to soften, orientation becomes less automatic. The mind, which is accustomed to labeling and categorizing experience, struggles with this fluidity. It attempts to reconstruct certainty by reaching for familiar definitions, but those definitions no longer fully align with current awareness, which creates further tension. At the same time, there is often a heightened sensitivity to internal contradictions. Actions may no longer fully match internal inclination, and this mismatch becomes more visible than before. A person may continue to engage in routines, relationships, or goals, but with an increasing awareness that participation does not always equal alignment. This awareness can create the impression of fragmentation, as if different parts of the self are no longer fully synchronized. However, this fragmentation is not a breakdown of identity into chaos, but a transition from rigid identity to a more observant form of consciousness. In this space, the question of who I am begins to lose its previously assumed simplicity. It is no longer answered through roles, achievements, or external labels with the same certainty as before. Instead, it becomes an open inquiry that does not resolve quickly. This openness is uncomfortable because it removes the illusion of final definition. Yet it also creates the conditions for a more flexible understanding of self that is not entirely dependent on past conditioning or external validation. As old identity structures lose dominance, there is often an instinctive attempt to rebuild them quickly. The mind seeks to replace uncertainty with new definitions, new goals, or new frameworks of self-understanding. But these replacements often feel temporary because they are constructed from the same need for fixed identity rather than from direct awareness. The deeper process unfolding is not about constructing a better version of the old self, but about recognizing that identity itself is more fluid than previously assumed. This stage does not immediately offer a new stable identity to replace the old one. Instead, it introduces a period where identity is experienced more as a process than a fixed structure. The sense of losing oneself is therefore not a disappearance of self, but a transition from identification with form toward observation of change itself. The second awakening is not an arrival at a final truth, but a shift in the way truth itself is experienced. It is the moment when a person stops searching for a permanent answer that will stabilize their entire existence and begins to recognize that life was never designed to be fully resolved into certainty. Instead of moving toward a fixed destination of understanding, awareness begins to move into a more fluid relationship with experience itself. What once felt like a journey toward clarity transforms into a deeper recognition that clarity is not a static state, but a continuous unfolding. At this stage, the mind gradually loosens its dependence on rigid definitions. Concepts that once structured identity and meaning begin to lose their absolute authority. Ideas about success, purpose, morality, and fulfillment are no longer accepted without internal examination. This does not mean they are rejected outright, but rather that they are no longer automatically assumed to be universally valid in the same way. The individual begins to see that many of the frameworks they relied on were useful but not necessarily final. They served a phase of development, but they were never meant to contain the totality of human experience. What emerges in place of rigid certainty is a different kind of awareness, one that is more observational than interpretive. Instead of immediately labeling experiences as good or bad, right or wrong, success or failure, there is a growing capacity to witness experience without rushing to define it. This shift does not remove judgment entirely, but it reduces its dominance. Life begins to be experienced with less internal compression, as if space is created between what happens and how it is understood. In that space, perception becomes more flexible and less reactive. This stage also redefines the relationship between control and understanding. In earlier phases of consciousness, there is often a strong desire to control outcomes in order to secure meaning. Control is seen as a way to guarantee stability and reduce uncertainty. However, in the second awakening, there is a gradual realization that control is limited and often based on incomplete perception. As this becomes clearer, the need for control begins to soften, not because life becomes easier, but because the illusion that control guarantees understanding starts to dissolve. With this shift, presence becomes more significant than prediction. Instead of constantly projecting into what should happen or what must be achieved, awareness begins to anchor more in what is actually unfolding. This does not eliminate planning or intention, but it changes their psychological weight. The future is no longer treated as something that must be fully secured in order for the present to be acceptable. The present moment begins to gain a quieter form of importance, not because it is ideal, but because it is real and immediate. As this awareness deepens, the sense of separation between observer and experience also becomes more noticeable. Life is still lived through roles, responsibilities, and interactions, but there is an increasing recognition that these are expressions within awareness rather than definitions of awareness itself. This creates a subtle but significant shift in identity. The self is no longer experienced solely as the content of thoughts, roles, and narratives, but also as the space in which those elements appear and disappear. The second awakening is often misunderstood as detachment from life, but it is not withdrawal. It is a change in the quality of engagement. Experience becomes less about reinforcing a fixed identity and more about understanding the movement of consciousness through changing forms. Emotional experiences still arise, but they are less likely to completely define the self. Thoughts still appear, but they are no longer automatically taken as absolute truth. This creates a quieter internal environment, not because life becomes less intense, but because identification with intensity is reduced. In this stage, meaning is no longer something that must be permanently secured. It becomes something that is discovered moment by moment rather than something imposed as a final framework. Life is no longer approached as a problem to be solved once and for all, but as an ongoing process to be experienced with increasing awareness. The second awakening is therefore not an endpoint, but a transformation in how endpoints themselves are understood and released. The conclusion of this journey is not a closure in the traditional sense, because what has been described is not a story that ends, but a process of perception that continues to unfold. What begins as confusion gradually becomes observation, and what begins as loss of certainty slowly becomes expansion of awareness. The second awakening does not give a final answer to who you are or what life is supposed to mean. Instead, it removes the urgency to force life into a single definition. At this point, something quiet but profound becomes noticeable. The need to constantly fix, define, or finalize existence begins to weaken. Life is no longer experienced as a problem that must be resolved immediately, but as a continuous movement that does not require complete understanding to be lived meaningfully. There is still uncertainty, still change, still emotional depth, but there is less resistance to the presence of these states. What once felt like instability begins to feel like openness. What once felt like emptiness begins to feel like space, and what once felt like losing oneself begins to feel like stepping out of a narrow definition that was never meant to contain the full complexity of being. The second awakening is not about becoming someone new in a fixed sense, but about loosening the grip on everything that was never fully you in the first place.